Let me start with a quotation. This quotation is from the French historian Pierre Nora. Memory is blind to all but the groups that it binds. History, on the other hand, belongs to everyone and no one, hence its claim to universal authority. In 1939, the historian Shimon Dubnov wrote a letter to the editors of the Paris-based Yiddish monthly, Unsere Zeit, with the title, "What Should One Do in Haman's Times?" He singled out two aspects of the crisis with which the Jewish world was confronted. The first was what he described as the counter-revolution, the attempt to undo the achievements of the French Revolution and its successors in laying the foundations for the system of constitutional, liberal and democratic states. The second was Hitler's, quotation mark, system of extermination, which he described as a new version of Haman's plan to destroy, to slay and cause to perish all Jews. Obviously, the situation that we face today is not comparable to that of 1939. However, we are seeing a widespread undermining of democratic principles and the triumph of an illiberal populism in Europe and beyond, not least in the three countries, Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine, which I'll be discussing this evening. There is also taking place an attempt to undermine the achievements of scholarship in documenting where Jews are to be located in the long history of Europe, and how the success and failures of integration and acculturation should be evaluated. And this has gone along with attempts to rewrite the history of the Holocaust so as to diminish the responsibility of what the Viennese-born historian Raoul Hilberg has described as bystanders, a term which is not always wholly appropriate. These developments have seriously threatened the attempt to subject the difficult and complex events of the past to historical analysis. What I want to do today is to examine how much has been achieved in the last 3 decades and how to respond to the threats which this achievement now faces. Clearly, the many-sided and acrimonious debates about the responsibility for the mass murder of Jews during the Second World War are part of a much wider argument about the totalitarian experience of Europe in the 20th century, both at the hands of fascist and at the hands of communist rulers. And this controversy reflects a growing preoccupation with the idea of collective memory. One key element in the understanding of collective memory is the dark past of nations, those aspects of the national past which provoke shame, guilt and regret, and which needs to be integrated into the national collective identity which itself is being continually reformulated. In this sense, memory has to be understood as a public discourse which helps to build group identity and which is inevitably entangled in a relationship of mutual dependence with other identity-building processes. The retrieval of the dark past is further complicated by a problem which has been highlighted in the work of Franklin Ankersmit, a Dutch historian. He maintains that the only point when the past truly exposes itself to us is at the moment of trauma, which causes shock and pain. Trauma causes our convictions, categories and expectations to shatter, and history is composed of traumatic collective experiences. The traumatic past is not a record of past events, but rather of the impact of experiences which cannot be accepted or assimilated. It has a paradoxical character in that it can neither be forgotten nor remembered. Yet at the same time, there is clearly a marked disinclination to confront these painful memories. Ankersmit argues that the only way of coping with such traumas is to accept that there's a conflict between memory and history, a conflict which is reflected in the quotation with which I began this lecture. The discourse of the historian, which merely examines the past, or which primarily examines the past, but does not try to explore or penetrate it, must be complemented by that of a traumatic memory. Now, this, of course, is the context in which research has been conducted in the difficult problem of the mass murder of the Jews in Europe. And this is central to the recovery and understanding of the dark past in many of the countries of Europe. The debates on this problem have only really been possible in situations where the political culture has permitted a public reckoning with the more dubious aspects of national past, and where there's a high level of acceptance of the practice of national self-criticism. And not surprisingly, these efforts have gone furthest in Germany, which of course was where this policy of mass murder was adopted and implemented. First in the Federal Republic of Germany, and subsequently in the United Germany established after 1989. Starting with the controversy aroused by the publication of Fritz Fischer's Griff nach der Weltmacht in 1961, German historians have undertaken a thorough and complex re-examination of their country's past, which has greatly clarified the problems of how the Nazis came to power, the nature of the regime they established, and how they came to adopt and implement their anti-Jewish genocide. A similar wide-ranging debate has also developed in France, although it's started somewhat later, over the character of the Vichy regime, the nature of the anti-Semitic policies it implemented, and the responsibility it bears for the death of perhaps a quarter of French Jews in the Holocaust. Analogous attempts to overcome the past have been undertaken in the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, and Switzerland, and elsewhere in Western and Central Europe. In East Central Europe, this debate, with one exception, that of Poland, only really began in 1989-91 with the collapse of communism in the region. In the Polish case, a debate on the question of the responsibility of the local population for the fate of the Jews did begin immediately after the war, but was stifled by the imposition of a rigidly Stalinist regime in 1947. In the other states of the area, which during the Second World War were allied with the Nazis, and in those areas where no state-level collaborationist regimes were established, such as Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, debates on this topic only really began after the end of communism. Since then, there has been considerable dispute over the role of General Ion Antonescu in Romania and Father Tiso in Slovakia, and of the conduct of the Nazi satellite regimes in Croatia and Hungary. And there's also been a good deal of discussion in Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, and rather less in Ukraine, about the participation of local militias and nationalist partisans in the mass murder of the Jews. What I want to examine now is how these debates have evolved in these countries, that is to say, above all, Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. And these have not been only internal matters, since Jewish survivors from these countries, and many others in the Jewish world, where the collective memory of these events was very different from that of the Poles, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians, have also played an active part in the attempts to reshape this memory. Since the Second World War, the interaction between Poles and Jews, insofar as these are mutually exclusive categories, has taken place in a number of arenas. In Poland itself, in Israel, in North America, and Western Europe. And if one is to understand the evolution of Polish-Jewish relations in the post-war period, and the rethinking of the Polish past, developments in all of these areas have to be taken into account. After 1945, Poles and Jews have been divided above all by their diametrically opposed and incompatible views of a shared past. The experience of the war and the imposition on Poland of an unpopular and unrepresentative communist dictatorship gave a new lease of life to the romantic view of Polish history, which saw Poland as the Christ of nations, a country of heroes and martyrs which had unstintingly sacrificed itself for Western values, and whose efforts had never been appreciated or understood by the materialistic West. In this history, Jews figured in a largely negative manner. Poland, Lithuania, before the partitions, had been a land without stakes, a country committed to religious toleration, which had given the Jews shelter when they had been persecuted elsewhere. Jews had not appreciated this hospitality. They had always remained a people apart, with their own language and culture, and little sense of loyalty to Poland. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Jews had welcomed the Red Army when it treacherously invaded eastern Poland, and had collaborated on a large scale with the Soviet occupiers. Under Nazi occupation, Poles had suffered more than any other nation. They had refused to collaborate, and their large-scale resistance had led to tremendous suffering, culminating in the German destruction of Warsaw. They were not implicated in the mass murder of Jews on Polish soil. On the contrary, many Poles lost their lives trying to save Jews. Jews, nevertheless, played a prominent part in the communist regime after 1944 and in its security apparatus. In the West, Jews have shown little awareness of the complexities of the Polish situation and have constantly blackened the good name of Poland. Not surprisingly, this view of the Polish past was not shared by most Jews. Their image of Poland was partly shaped by their memories of Polish behavior before, during, and after the war, and more particularly by the views expressed by Polish Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. More than 90% of Poland's 3.5 million Jews perished during the Second World War, and those who survived had, for the most part, bitter memories. They remembered the anti-Jewish violence which had accompanied the establishment of Polish independence and the intensification of anti-Semitism after the death of Pilsudski in 1935. They believed that most of their Polish fellow citizens had been indifferent to the fate of the Jews under Nazi rule, and that a significant minority had denounced Jews to the Nazis or participated in anti-Jewish violence. Those who fell into these categories far outnumbering those who attempted to aid Jews in these difficult conditions. They were shocked by the persistence of anti-Semitism as exemplified in the anti-Jewish violence after 1944 and the anti-Zionist purge of 1968, and regarded the attempt to stigmatize the Jews for the behavior of a small number of communists of Jewish origin as an anti-Semitic reflex and an attempt at imposing collective responsibility on the Jews. In the late 1970s and 1980s, this situation began to change. In Poland, a new willingness to examine the thorny and difficult problem of Polish-Jewish relations grew out of the growth of interest in the Polish-Jewish past, which was a feature of these years. This interest was partly nostalgic in character. Poland is today practically mono-ethnic and mono-religious, although this homogeneity should not be exaggerated, and there was a genuine sense of loss at the disappearance of the more colourful Poland of the past, with its mixture of religions and nationalities. It did, however, have a deeper character. The experiences of the Solidarity movement in 1980-81 gave the Poles a greater sense of self-esteem. In sharp contrast with the traditional stereotype of the Poles as quixotic and impractical political dreamers, in these years Poland astonished the world by its political maturity. Increasingly too, particularly among the younger generation, there was a growing sense of shame over the events of the anti-Zionist campaign of 1968. At the time, the prevailing mood was that this was merely a settling of accounts among the discredited communist elite, and all the party factions fighting for power were equally tainted. By the late 1970s, however, the realization that one of the consequences of these years had been to deprive Poland of most of what remained of its Jewish intelligentsia, and that society had allowed itself to be manipulated by the crude use of anti-Semitic slogans, led to an increasing feeling of anger. In Israel, North America and Europe, there was also a growing awareness of the importance of the Polish-Jewish past. As a result, the 1980s were marked by a series of academic conferences in Oxford, Brandeis, Krakow and Jerusalem, in which all aspects of the Polish-Jewish past were aired and discussed in a critical manner. This created a new situation. An international cadre of scholars involved in Polish-Jewish history had emerged and were provided with a forum in which they could express their views. The Oxford Conference was also a key factor in leading the Polish literary critic Jan Błoński to write his article Biedni Polacy patrzą na ghetto, The Poor Poles Look at the Ghetto, in the Catholic journal Tygodnik Powszechny on 11th of January 1987. This was a major turning point in the discussion of Polish-Jewish issues in post-war Poland. In it, Błoński called on the Poles to accept some responsibility for the fate of their Jewish citizens under Nazi occupation. This guilt did not consist, in his view, of involvement in the mass murder of the Jews, in which he claimed the Poles had not participated significantly. It had two aspects. First, there was the Poles', as he put it, insufficient effort to resist, their holding back from offering help to the Jews. And this was the consequence of the second aspect, that the Poles had not, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, created conditions in which the Jews could be integrated into the Polish national community. I quote from Polonsky: "If only we had behaved more humanely in the past, had been wiser, more generous, then genocide would perhaps have been less imaginable, would probably have been considerably more difficult to carry out, and almost certainly would have met with much greater resistance than it did. To put it differently, it would not have met with the indifference and moral turpitude of the society in whose full view it took place." Now, the controversy over Polonsky's article, which was extensive, revealed that the desire to come to terms with the more problematic aspects of the Polish past was still to be found only within a minority of the Polish intelligentsia, and was not shared by the society as a whole. Indeed, there was a great deal of critical response to it. But it was a major step forward, and in the 1990s there were a series of debates between those supporting this more self-critical view of the Polish past and those adopting a more apologetic position. What is striking about these debates is their moral character. It's no accident that several of them took place in the Catholic periodical Tygodnik Powszechny, and this is why its editor, Jerzy Turowicz, who died in 1998, pointed out that the argument between the two sides was conducted, as he put it, on totally different planes, between those who were primarily concerned to assert moral values and those who were concerned rather to explain and excuse behavior on the grounds that political conditions made anything else impossible to achieve. At the same time, two new developments stimulated a more fundamental rethinking of attitudes towards Jews and the Jewish question. A large mass of new historical material provided a much fuller picture of Polish-Jewish relations in the 20th century. Obviously, the end of communism also ended censorship, and people could publish much more easily. And at the same time, there was the emergence of a new generation of Polish-Jewish writers, people like Henryk Grinberg or Hanna Kral, or people who had come to maturity earlier, now published more widely, who brought a new and unique voice to this debate. They wrote in Polish, they spoke as Poles who were also Jews. And this was the context for the debate provoked by the publication of Jan Gross's book Neighbours, which was first published in Polish as Sąsiedzi, Historia Zagłady Żydowskiego Miasteczka, the history of the destruction of a Jewish shtetl, in 2000. On the basis of evidence produced for a trial in 1949, the book describes in detail an incident in 1941 in the town of Jedwabne, in the northeast of today's Poland, in which, with some German incitement but little actual assistance, the local population brutally murdered the overwhelming majority of its Jewish neighbors. Almost the entire Jewish population, along with many Jewish refugees from other localities, were driven out of their homes and herded to the marketplace. Many were beaten to death with poles, brooms, or axes. Some were murdered at the Jewish cemetery. The vast majority, perhaps as many as 700, were forced to enter a barn near the cemetery, which was then set on fire, burning alive those inside it. Now, the debate on Jedwabne was the most serious, protracted, and profound on the issue of Polish-Jewish relations since the end of the war. There's no time here to look at the debate, which is still continuing. But it does seem to me that in spite of the many discordant voices, the response of Polish society, at least until recent years, was largely positive, and this led to a new awareness of the need to confront the more problematic aspects of the national past. And this affected not only the understanding of the Polish-Jewish past, but also relations between Poles and Germans and Poles and Ukrainians. The Polish-Russian divide, although the foreign minister Ratman tried to deal with this after 2008, has not yet been subjected to this sort of analysis. An encouraging aspect of the debate was the more nuanced understanding of the Polish situation in the Jewish world, which it revealed. Subsequent debates, such as that provoked by Jan Gross's subsequent books, Fear, which described the persistence of anti-Jewish violence in post-war Poland, and Golden Harvest, which described the looting of Jewish property, and in particular the desire of people after the end of the war to dig up the grounds of the concentration camp in Treblinka to find the allegedly Jewish gold which had been hidden there, have shown that Polish opinion is divided between a pluralistic group and a more ethno-nationalist group. Among the historians, the first is in the majority. In the society as a whole, it's difficult to say, and the society does remain deeply divided. I spend quite a lot of time in Poland. In the circles that I mix, you can go around for a week without ever meeting anybody who supports the government, and I'm sure that it is the same is true for people on the other side. Grosser's work has stimulated a new school of Holocaust historians in Poland at the Center for the Study of the Jewish Holocaust, associated with the Polish Academy of Sciences. They've concentrated on the final stage of the Holocaust in Poland, which took place after the liquidation of the ghettos in the large towns. In the smaller towns, ghettos were more porous, and many Jews were able to escape. One of the historians of this school argues that it was around 300,000, although others have argued that this figure was too high. However, Polish-Jewish relations in these towns had been much more distant before the war. The Jews who sought shelter among the local population did not, for the most part, find it, and fewer than 50,000 of them survived to the end of the war, as they were hunted down by the German occupying authorities and, in some well-documented cases, murdered by underground units or betrayed by the local population. Again, I haven't got time to enumerate the individual historians, Grabowski, Skibinski, Henkel King-Borny, and others. There has been also considerable debate between the more apologetic and more self-critical historians on the evaluation of the number and motivation of those Poles who risked their lives to rescue Jews. And here I would stress that these people are unquestionably heroes of this dark period. The question is only the evaluation of how significant a proportion of the population they are. In the debate over Grosser's book, his critics frequently alluded to the more than 6,300 Christian Polish rescuers who have been so far honored by Yad Vashem. They often claim that this figure is only a fraction of the total number. One of the more apologetic historians has argued that there were 400,000 Christian Polish rescuers of the Jews in Warsaw alone. The Prime Minister, Mr. Morawiecki, has argued that Poland as a whole should be given the decoration of righteous among nations. They also frequently allude to the heroic actions of people like Irena Sendler in Warsaw and the Ulmer family in Markowa in the Rzeszów district of Poland, who were murdered by the Germans along with the Jews that they were hiding. The apologetic character of much of this research has led to attempts to place the situation of rescuers in a larger historical context, stressing how they were frequently regarded with hostility by the surrounding population and pointing out the often complex character of their motivation in providing assistance. Many of them did so for monetary gain. Not that this makes them any less heroic, but of course it does shed some light on their behavior, since in some cases when the money ran out, they did denounce their Jews. In the case of the Markowa, in the case of the Ulmer family, when the Ulmers were murdered, a large number of families who were hiding Jews handed them over to the Nazis or the local police, or sometimes murdered them out of fear for what would happen to them. Again, these are people acting in very difficult situations. I'm not judging them. I'm trying really to place this in its context. This is a very important subject, and we need a nuanced and comprehensive history of the rescue of Jews in Poland. This is a very important topic and needs to be undertaken. Let me move on now to Lithuania. Here, Lithuanian and Jewish collective memories were even further apart than those of Poles and Jews, which I already described. The Lithuanians who lost their independence after the Second World War felt that the Jews had shown little regard for the favorable way they had been treated in interwar Lithuania, and held the Jews collectively responsibility for aiding the first and second Soviet occupations of the country, the first in 1940 and the second after the end of the Second World War. Only a small number of Lithuanians had participated in the mass murder of the Jews, comparable in their view to the minority of alleged Jewish collaborators with the Soviets. Jews, for their parts, as one might expect, highlighted the growth of anti-Semitism in the 1930s and were particularly affronted by what they saw as the massive involvement of Lithuanians in the mass murder of the Jews, both just before the establishment of Nazi rule and particularly in cooperation with the Nazi occupiers. Given the large-scale complicity of Lithuanians in the mass murder of the Jews, the traumatic effect of the two Soviet occupations, the second lasting more than nearly half a century, and the unstable nature of the Lithuanian political scene, with the temptation that this affords to demagogic behavior, it's not surprising that the discussion of these wartime issues has proved both difficult and painful. And this was further complicated by the fact that two separate issues have been involved: the establishment of an accurate and fully documented record of what occurred during the Nazi occupation, and the call to prosecute Lithuanians who had committed crimes against humanity in being involved in the mass murder of Jews. Some progress has been made on elucidating the problems of Lithuanian complicity in the Holocaust. New studies followed the end of communist rule and the freedom, which of course was much greater in the case of Lithuania than had been in Poland, which was a relatively liberal authoritarian state rather than totalitarian, as was the case in Lithuania. New studies examined the anti-Judaic policies of the Catholic Church and the emergence of modern Lithuanian anti-Semitism after in the late 19th century, as well as the further deterioration in the 20th century. And Jewish scholars were also involved in these efforts. The need to consolidate independence and to ease Lithuanians' entry into NATO and the European Union also dictated an improvement in relations with the Jewish world. And this led to a number of statements by Lithuanian public figures, most notably the President of Lithuania, Brzezauskas, who, in his address to the Knesset in March 1995, publicly asked for forgiveness for the actions of those Lithuanians who mercilessly murdered, shot, deported, and robbed Jews. The growing need for self-criticism in the Roman Catholic Church also had its impact. On 13th March 2000, the Bishops' Conference of the Lithuanian Catholic Church expressed its regret that during the Nazi period, a portion of the faithful failed to demonstrate a charity to the persecuted Jews, did not grasp any opportunity to defend them, and lacked the determination to influence those who aided the Nazis. Prosecution of war criminals created much more difficulty and mutual irritation. In the end, only 2 individuals were prosecuted, and one of them was convicted but was not punished because he was suffering from senile dementia, and the other was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment but was not compelled to complete the sentence because of his advanced age. It was in an attempt to put these issues to rest that in September 1998, President Adamkus set up an attempt to investigate the 2 occupations of Poland, of Lithuania. It was headed by Emanuela Zingeris, and its role was to investigate the Second World War period and its immediate aftermath in order to come up with answers to various questions concerning the Jewish and Lithuanian genocide. It produced 6 volumes, both in Lithuanian and in English, and I'm sure they're in the library of this university, if not, and they're easily accessible. The most important volume was the one written by Christoph Diekmann, a German scholar, and Shaulus Sujedelis, an American-based Lithuanian scholar, called The Persecution and Mass Murder of Lithuanian Jews during the Summer and Fall of 1941. It concluded that, quote, the actual killings were organized by the head of the police in occupied Lithuania and were for the most part carried out by 2 Einsatzgruppen. But they had extensive support from the headquarters of the Lithuanian Police Department in Kaunas, local precincts, German and Lithuanian police battalion personnel, and local volunteers. And these conclusions were anathema to the more nationalist elements in Lithuania, who were also hostile to the post-communists who had returned to power in 2001. They lost power again in 2008. They decided, therefore, or at least they undertook the attempt to prosecute or to call for a prosecution of one of the members of the commission, the former head of Yad Vashem, Yitzhak Arad, because of his description of his activities as a teenage partisan in the Soviet partisan forces. The goal seemed to be to demonstrate the alleged moral equivalence of Lithuanian and Jewish behavior. And along with Arad, there were also calls to prosecute two women partisans, Fania Bransovskaya and Rachel Margolis. Faced with a storm of protest, the general prosecutor dropped the prosecution against Arad, and the two women were also not prosecuted. But this certainly showed the resistance to the attempt to confront the difficult past. In 2016, the publication of Ruta Vanagaitė's Aus in Lithuanian Mūsiškai by a well-known journalist documented on the basis of a large number of interviews the Lithuanian involvement in the mass murder of the Jews. This has sometimes been described as the Lithuanian equivalent of Neighbours, and it provoked a debate in Lithuania similar to that in Poland. However, as in Poland, it led to a divisive response with two widely differing histories, one self-critical, the other more apologetic. And this is borne out by the recent attacks on Vanagaitė in the context of naming Alfonsas Ramanauskas, a post-war anti-Soviet guerrilla who has been named Man of the Year for 2019 for the 100th anniversary of, or 2018-19 for the 100th anniversary of Polish independence. Ukrainian and Jewish collective memories are also very far apart. The heroes of the Ukrainian struggle for independence, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Haidamaki, the peasant rebels of the 18th century, and Semyon Petlura, have been widely seen in the Jewish world as anti-Semites and pogromists. Jews are often shocked to see a statue of Khmelnytsky in the center of Kiev, and also that he has a town named after him, Khmelnytsk. Until the establishment of independence in 1991, there was little discussion of the Holocaust in Ukraine. The Soviets subsumed the Jewish experience during the war in the general sufferings of the Soviet people, and in Ukraine there was little desire to examine the vexed question of local complicity. In addition, many of the new officials, both because they'd filled the positions of Jews and because of the desire to make the regime more attuned to the local mood, shared the popular anti-Semitic prejudices. Independence did, however, make possible the airing of difficult problems. There's not yet been a thorough examination of the murder of the Jews, although the debate in 2003 over the violent Polish-Ukrainian conflict, which began in 1943 in Volhynia, revealed the same existence as elsewhere between those historians who advocate a form of civic nationalism and ethno-nationalists. The first major debate about the Holocaust was provoked by the memoirs of a Ukrainian writer, Yevhen Nakonieczny, who described the situation in Lviv, and although he, in some cases, justified Ukrainian behavior, he did give a sympathetic picture of the plight of Jews during the Nazi occupation. In 2005, a similar debate, but of a more far-reaching character, took place in the Kiev liberal periodical Kritika, provoked by an article by the young historian Sofia Hrachkova. This debate has continued, and in a number of places it's been taken quite seriously. I went recently to the Jewish Tekuma Museum in Dnipro, where these issues are very well aired in a very large museum. But the debate has been complicated by the struggle for Ukrainian independence and the fighting which has resulted, and also the legitimacy which this has lent to right radical forces. There's a good article in Haaretz yesterday on this topic. The government has been concerned to dispel accusations from Moscow of anti-Semitism, and this has led the Ukrainian Institute for National Memory to take often a strongly apologetic view on problems like the ethnic cleansing of Poles in Volhynia and on the involvement of the Ukrainian partisan organization in the murder of Jews. At the same time, strongly self-critical views have also been widely aired. And these discussions, however, have been made more difficult by the adoption in 2014, somewhat before the Polish amendment to the EPIN law, by the Ukrainian parliament of a law on the legal status and honoring of the memory of the participants in the struggle for the independence of Ukraine in the 20th century. This law also commemorates members of organizations that collaborated with Nazi Germany, including the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and their armed wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army of Stefan Bandera, the UPA. Now, the fact is that this and this has led to strong criticism of those historians who've taken a more critical view of, for instance, Bandera. In 2012, even before this law was passed, the organizers of a visit of a young Polish-German scholar, Grzegorz Rossoliński-Lieber, who wrote a comprehensive, though rather critical biography of Stefan Bandera, was forced to cancel most of the public lectures which he was organizing, which were organized for him. I hope that this comparative approach has highlighted the common problems that all of these three countries face in coming to terms with the dark past, and the dangers posed to it by the rise of populism. If one can make a generalization, the difference in some ways between the three countries is that in Poland this debate is much more highly developed, but in each case where populists develop, they are above all preoccupied by a single internal enemy. And in the Polish case, this is the Jews, but in the Ukrainian case, this is the Russians, and in the Lithuanian case, this is the Poles. So it's easier in some cases for the Ukrainians and Lithuanians to combine an absence of a proper debate on this at the level which took place in Poland with gestures towards the Jewish community or towards the Jewish world, since for them the Jews are not the real enemy. The real enemy for the populists there are the Russians or the Lithuanians. But having said that, I do believe that in all three countries it is the debate among historians which offers the best chance to move forward. And here I believe this should be an open debate. And one of the distressing features about the Polish situation, which I very much am aware of since I spent quite a lot of time there, is that we're back to the situation in the 1970s when people told you can't shake hands with such a person. You can't talk to such a person. The society is deeply divided and polarized, and we should be talking to each other. What we need is not a Polish-Jewish dialogue, but a Polish-Polish dialogue. And therefore, it's very much my hope that the debate among historians can be conducted in an open and collegial manner. We need to remember that the past cannot be altered. We can only accept the tragic and shocking events which have occurred, and to try and learn from them. And this process obviously could only begin with the collapse of the communist system, but it does need to be carried forward. The first stage in this approach does seem to have required a moral approach, and that is involved with apologies. And in all of these cases there have been these apologies. I've never been a great proponent of these apologies. Generally speaking, it seems to me that the people who should be apologizing have not apologized, and those who are apologizing, for the most part, don't have that much to apologize for. And I had thought that we had moved to a second stage where apologetics would increasingly be replaced by careful and detailed research and a nuanced and first-hand testimony. Unfortunately, the recent controversy aroused by the amendments to the law on the Institute of National Memory, passed a year ago by the Polish government, and that over the work of Ruta Vanagaite in Lithuania, has shown how quickly the progress made in this area can be undermined. I fully recognize that the use of terms like Polish concentration camps and collective accusations of participation in genocide against the Polish government or the Polish nation, as of the Lithuanian government or the Lithuanian people or Ukrainian people, are offensive. However, I have serious doubts about the use of the law to deal with this problem. And I therefore welcomed, for all its complications, the decision of the Polish Prime Minister, Morawiecki, to introduce legislation removing the clauses in the law criminalizing claims that the Polish nation or the Polish Republic of Poland is responsible or co-responsible for Nazi crimes. And this, the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland 2 weeks ago also removed those clauses criminalizing any attempt to justify the behavior of the Ukrainian nationalists and Ukrainian partisan association. And clearly these issues are much better dealt with by intellectual debate and education. For those of us who are active in this area, the problem of how we get this education across, how we get the findings which we have all now more or less, which we are at least agreed on, is a very complicated one, and maybe museums are part of the answer, and maybe films are part of the answer, but I don't have a clear answer to this. The fact is that in Poland, and to a lesser extent in Lithuania and Ukraine, there has been a large body of research in the last decades, especially since the end of communism. And this has illuminated all aspects of the behavior of these societies and of the complex interaction between the Jews and their neighbors. A community of scholars has been created, among whom a degree of trust was established. And this process needs to be continued. Enormous progress has been made on understanding our common history and what unites and divides us. And I hope that the debate on all aspects of this difficult past should now continue in a more congenial atmosphere, and that we can build on the achievements of the many people who've worked so hard over the last 40 years to recreate the lost world in which Jews and their neighbors lived side by side, sometimes in mutual respect, sometimes in conflict. I believe it's our obligation to do all we can to preserve this valuable legacy. Whether we will succeed, I don't know. But we need to do this because it is our moral obligation. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Polonsky, for this very impressive lecture and for these last words that are clearly in the spirit of Ian Carton and James Parks, and so had a very good place here. Thank you very much. In contrast to other normal seminars, we do the question and answer now and invite you to a glass of wine later. Ask my director first if it's really true, but we do. So can I invite you questions?
Do you think that Polish antipathy towards the question of any responsibility they may hold for the Holocaust comes from a sense of enough about them, what about us? The feeling that Polish suffering in the Second World War has been pushed aside from international comment in favour of commentary on the Holocaust and the Jews.
I think that the debate which developed was a necessary debate, but that because of the way in which it developed, it was seen by many people in Poland as accusatory. I don't think this was the intention of the Grossers or the Skibinskas or the Engelkings, but if we think of the larger context, the previous government in which this all took place was seen by many as being too cosmopolitan, not sufficiently Polish, too European, and not sufficiently sensitive to Polish suffering. And obviously Polish suffering during the Second World War was on a catastrophic scale. The number of civilians who died is probably not 3 million. These numbers are offensive because even if it's only 2 million actual civilians who died, is 2 million not enough? But yes, I think that this is the case, and I think that it is important to highlight the nature of the suffering, and also Polish heroic behavior, the behavior of rescuers, the behavior of people who tried to bring the understanding of what was happening under Nazi rule, the Karskis and the Pileckis, to a wider public. And I think that this is one of the mistakes of the present government's historical policy. It's much better. I remember the late Władysław Bartoszewski, former one of the leaders of Żegota and later Polish foreign minister, saying it's much better if Poles criticize Polish behavior and Jews criticize Jewish behavior, and Jews praise Polish behavior and Poles praise Jewish behavior. This is much better done in a situation where there's mutual trust, but this mutual trust has been eroded, and the problem is how to recreate it. But yes, unquestionably, mistakes were made in this case, and I think that the same was true in the case of Lithuania and Ukraine. A debate in which one side says, first admit you're a bunch of anti-Semitic swine, then we'll talk to you, is not actually going to be very productive.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I'm curious to what extent, what role language plays in all these discourses. So to what extent Polish scholarship, it seems to require multilingual scholars. And my question is, to what extent is that actually the case? What is translated? Where are the
Well, I'm no longer supervising graduate students, but I always said that if we are, to my students, if you are to understand the situation of Jews in Poland, not only during the Second World War, but over the longer durée, you need to know Polish and probably also Russian for the 19th century, German. There are a lot of languages that people need to know. And yes, I think that the group of scholars in Warsaw around the Center for the Study of the Jewish Holocaust do know these languages, and they've done very impressive work. Most recently, there is this collective work which is being translated into English, edited by Grabowski and Engelking, called Dalej jest noc. The night is far. You know, when we won't be able to survive because the night is far. This is a very impressive investigation of the context of mass murder in Poland. I would say one of the paradoxes here is that there's been a lot of research on the wider aspects of Polish-Jewish interaction, going back to the first settlement of Jews in Poland in the 10th century, before the establishment even of a Polish state, up to the present day. And this is in some ways, if one is trying to create a better atmosphere, more important than history than the study of the Holocaust. It reminds me of the Irish joke about the man who asked what was the best way to go to Dublin, and the answer was, if I was going to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here. So if you want to start by creating a better understanding, which is part of the goal here, the Second World War is obviously a difficult problem, but this is an issue which everybody needs to confront, and so you can't avoid that. But yes, this does require these linguistic skills, but a cadre of historians has been created over the last 30 years. The previous group of people who worked in this field, who were also very impressive, mostly didn't survive the Holocaust, but we do have a cadre of scholars. The problem is, and this I've mentioned already, that the scholarship is by and large self-critical. The number of apologetic works is quite limited, and most of them aren't that impressive, at least not to me. The problem is that the scholarly works are read by the usual people, the 5,000 scholars working in the field, and they don't have much wider impact. And this has been our failure. I mean, I regard this as a failure on our side. We did not convince the society as a whole, so that when the populists started saying this is all done by a bunch of urban liberals not sympathetic towards our national cause, this had a good response. But I think that there is a genuine understanding, at least in the Polish case, of the complexity of this issue. And although Prime Minister Morawiecki's agreement with Netanyahu, which brought to an end, which was one of the aspects of the repeal of the law on the two clauses in the IPN Nowelizacja, made a series of rather cliché-like remarks. We will investigate both the good and the bad sides of this relationship. This is what you expect governments to say, and that needs to be said, and I think that that is understood. And I think that it's also understood to a degree in Lithuania and in Ukraine. In both of these countries, for the reasons that I've said, you have a situation in which this sort of research is less highly developed, but the issues are less explosive for the reasons that I've described. But I think that this is part of a wider problem, which is the attempt to replace liberal democratic systems by what Viktor Orban described as illiberal democracies. And this is clearly on the agenda of Jarosław Kaczynski. And to some extent, I mean, Lithuania has a coalition government in which both populists and liberal Democrats are represented. And in Ukraine, the constraints of the war limit the amount of political discourse, but there too, the legitimacy of far-right forces is widely accepted. So there is a challenge to democratic values throughout the system, throughout the area, and the pursuit of historical truth, and I do believe there is a historical truth, although how one defines it is rather complex, is made more difficult where people are accused of being un-Polish, disloyal, traitors. This is not a climate in which, and this is part of a larger climate, and you know, I followed quite closely the evolution of Polish opinion since the tragic murder of Paweł Adamowicz, the mayor of Gdańsk, last month. The hope that this would lead to a sobering of discourse, that both sides would realize that the discourse of hate leads to murder in this case. And I know the man was mad, or at least was demented, but I mean, he picked on one of the key aspects of the propaganda of the government, which is that the legal system is corrupt and in the hands of a mafia and needs to be radically reformed, and that was why he believed he'd been imprisoned. So this stuff is in the air and can be used by madmen, but I'm afraid to say that it doesn't seem to me that there's been a lessening of the divide. On the contrary, each side sees itself as justified by what happened. The opposition because one of their leading figures was murdered, the government because they brought this on themselves by their hate speech. So what we need is what we need is a Polish-Polish dialogue, and the same is true in Ukraine in a different way, which will re-establish the basic principle of a democratic system, that the other side has the right to be heard. And even though one may differ with somebody's opinion, this doesn't diminish his right to express his deepest held convictions. That's not, unfortunately, the situation now. How one gets back to that, I don't know. But I think that we need constantly to reaffirm these values. And I don't think that democratic values or that the democratic ideal has lost, but it's on the defensive and it needs to be defended.
Just for the first part of your question, Magdalena Waligórska has just published a new book on the importance of translation in European Jewish history. I'll send you a link. Then we have two, Claire and Claire.
Thank you very much. You approach the question from a very institutional point of view and political point of view, top-down point of view. And my feeling when I go to Belarus, which I know better, but is that a lot of this work confronting the Holocaust actually is done by individual people, grassroots initiatives, so creating a local museum or writing a book. And I was wondering if you could say more on that and on what is the part and the role played by, the politics, government decisions, laws, scholarly work, and what actually people do, the local, cultural, non-governmental initiatives.
This is I left this out. I tried to finish so that there would be time for discussion, but you're absolutely right. I think that the top-down approach has not been that successful. Michal Bilewicz, a sociologist at the University of Warsaw, did a study of the effectiveness of Holocaust education in Polish schools. By and large, it's not effective. So you say, people immediately, the question was already raised, why we talk about them, why don't we talk about us? And we've heard this all before, we know this, it's all boring. And anyway, adolescents often don't care that much for their teachers. The local initiatives have been much more successful. Forum for Dialogue, Andrzej Folwarczny, for instance, has tried to interest local towns in the history of their past, which obviously in Poland means a large part of the population, in some cases the majority, who were Jews. And this is much more productive in creating an understanding of how we got to the situation and what happened to these people during the war and how one should respond to it. Similarly, groups like Brama Grodzka, the theatre group in Lublin. Brama Grodzka means the town gate. It's the area, it's the gate between the old town where mostly Christians lived and the Jewish suburb, which means outside the walls, where the Jews lived. And this is an attempt again to create, this lost world where Poles and Jews, insofar as they were distinct, lived side by side. Museums, I work in a museum. Museums are also important. Of course, there's a sort of war of museums, but even the museum at Markowa, which glorifies the Ulmer family, is not as, it's not good, but at least it enables one, it is a dialogue. And one of the things that we've tried to do at the museum is to engage in a constructive dialogue with the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising, which is a museum which was set up by the late Lech Kaczynski and which does expound a basically self-justifying and apologetic position, but they've made some changes, partly under influence from outside. I don't think we should give up on dialogue, and I think that museums is one case here where one can see this. Everybody knows about what happened to Pavel Marksevich and the Museum of the History of the Second World War. But in fact, paradoxically, what Marksevich tried to do was to set up the permanent exhibition. And that hasn't been changed, because to change a permanent exhibition means basically to knock down a building. It's not really possible to do that. There has been a film at the end now, which is sort of a terrible animated film made by the Institute for National Memory, but most of what was there has been preserved, and I think that what's important is to try and work on this. But I do think that the local initiatives from a longer term point of view are important. I also think that the church in the Polish case and also the Lithuanian case is very important. The church has been strongly identified with the present government. After the assassination of Adamovich, there were voices in the church who said we need to question what we are doing here. They're a minority within the church. Bishop Richard Woods is one, the man who spoke, the parish priest who spoke at the memorial service is another. I think that that's another area which will change in the long run. If the Catholic Church could change or lose its hegemonic position in society in Ireland, in Quebec, in Italy, in Spain, you have to be a real pessimist to not believe that the same process is happening in Poland. And there's a lot of evidence. The film Claire, which is an anti-clerical film made recently by Smogorzewski, is the film which has had the largest audience of any film in Poland in the last 10 years. And it is a devastating picture of corruption within the church, both pedophilia and the desire for accumulation of wealth. And I mean, although the church took on board that this criticism had been widely heard, the situation is, I mean, I don't think the situation is hopeless, but it's difficult, and all of these avenues need to be explored.
Thank you. The Parks Institute studies the interaction between Christian and Jewish cultures. And you touched on my question in the last part of your answer to the previous question, which is, although we live in an increasingly secular humanist society in this country, and I guess that's probably reflected right across cultures you've mentioned there, during the time you're talking about in the Second World War, that was less so, and the churches, I guess, were much more influential. Was there a difference within the church's response to the Jewish Holocaust within those different countries, and was that reflected at all in their teaching or in the approach that they took?
It's a very interesting and important question, and it will take a long time to answer it fully, but I'll try and summarize. There was no clear statement by the Polish hierarchy against the mass murder of the Jews. But there was a willingness on the part of individual convents in particular to shelter Jews. So a fairly large number of people survived, children most obviously, by being sheltered in convents. The church was also savagely persecuted, that is the Polish Catholic Church, by the Nazis. A fifth of Polish parish priests were murdered by the Nazis. This made action less effective. But I think that the church did not fully take on board the anti-Christian character of the genocide and did not sufficiently condemn it. One well-known saint, his father, Maximilian Kolbe, who was sent to Auschwitz and gave up his life in order to allow a man who had a family who'd been condemned to death to survive. And that's unquestionably a saintly act, to give up one's life for somebody else. But Kolbe was also the editor of a pre-war paper, Mały Dziennik, which was viciously anti-Semitic. And I didn't find any evidence, although some people have claimed there is evidence, that he changed his views after being incarcerated in Auschwitz. This issue hasn't been fully studied in the Polish case, partly because the church has not opened its archives fully. He probably should do this, but it's not an institution which is a great believer in opening its archives. The Vatican is a similar problem. The Lithuanian case is similar to the Polish case, except that, and initially, of course, the Lithuanian hierarchy welcomed the Nazi occupation because it expelled the previous Soviet occupiers who were seen as worse. When it became apparent that there was no place in the Nazi New Europe, or no really acceptable place in the Nazi New Europe for the Lithuanian state, the Church came out against the attempt by the Nazis to set up Lithuanian Waffen-SS division, and I think that was important. It also spoke out against the expropriation of Jewish property, or at least the taking of Jewish property by Lithuanians, not because this was in itself bad, although obviously it was, but because of the greed which it displayed and the conflicts which it created in Lithuanian society. The Ukrainian case is much more complicated, and because the Ukrainians, as everybody knows, are divided religiously between the supporters of an autocephalic Ukrainian church, that is an Orthodox church with its headquarters in Kiev, which was only just beginning to develop, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church linked to the Moscow Patriarchate, and the Greek Catholic Church, which was strong, particularly in West Ukraine, which was in communion with the Pope, but which preserved the Orthodox liturgy and church organization, including the married priesthood. The Greek Catholic Church, and in particular its Metropolitan Archbishop Sheptytsky, welcomed the Nazi invasion initially because it brought to an end Bolshevism. But Sheptytsky was a very old-style figure, a believer in old-style Christian-Jewish dialogue, sheltered significant numbers of Jews in the headquarters of the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, the monastery of Sviatoy, and also made the only strong Catholic statement against the Holocaust. In it, he said that there are two commandments which the faithful are not observing. On the one hand, the commandment that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and the other, that you shall not murder. And those who believe that one can disobey these commandments on grounds of a higher political rationalization are damned and need to be excommunicated, and this needs to be brought home to them. It's a very eloquent statement. It's interesting that obviously he was a member of the Roman Communion, so he must have had at some level green light for this from Pope Pius XII, who never made such a statement. It would have been much better if he had. Nor Cardinal Clond, who was the primate of the Polish Catholic Church. So this is a very important statement. What we don't know about it is, and he also says that people should put pressure on those people who are participating in this to give up these activities and so on. We don't know what its impact was, because it hasn't been properly studied. Again, we're into apologetics, just as Jan Karski or Irena Senderova are seen as, and Irena Sendler said, I really feel very embarrassed that I'm being made the excuse for Polish behavior. These people have been made into examples of how fine behavior took place. Their actions haven't been properly examined, contextualized, and investigated, and they need to be. Because, again, Sheptytsky was unquestionably a hero, but he also did some rather negative things, applauded the Nazi invasion, blessed the Ukrainian Waffen-SS. But you need to understand the context, and this has not been done yet properly.
We have time for one, two more, Danny?
You've got 3 countries here. Is there a reason why you chose those 3? What about the rest of Eastern Europe? Latvia?
Well, these are the countries, yes.
With the same sort of general comments applied.
Basically, it's a question of how much time you have, because if you're going to do a sort of overview, you have to simplify drastically, which I obviously did, and I hope I did give time for questions. But if I'd examined more, it would have been even more difficult. I chose these 3 countries because they are all very similar. Ukraine was, most of Ukraine, in fact all of Ukraine at least until the middle of the 17th century, was under Polish rule. Polish cultural influence in Ukraine was very strong. Polish nobility remained a major factor in Ukraine until the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution, and in West Ukraine until 1939. Lithuania and Poland are the two countries in Europe most closely resembling each other. You know, we always talk about the Baltics, but the Baltics are very, very different from each other. Latvia is very different from Lithuania and from Estonia. So I chose three countries which were really very similar. These were all countries in which the Nazi occupation was particularly brutal, in which the Nazis did not establish a collaborationist regime, although they established local level of collaboration. The idea there were no collaborators in Poland is not the case. We have just given a fellowship at the Holocaust Memorial Museum to Grzegorz Rosoliński-Lieber, the author of this important biography of Bandera, who's one of these peculiar characters who's partly Polish, partly Ukrainian, and partly German, as his name suggests. And he's doing a study of Polish collaboration. Polish mayors remained in office throughout the occupation. Polish police remained in existence, although under Nazi control. So all of these countries have a low level of collaboration, and at different levels. So there's more to compare here than in the wider context. So I find this a useful context. I also think, if you think about the Polish debates, neither the self-critical nor the apologetic historians like these debates, like this comparative approach. The self-critical historians don't like this comparative approach. You won't find this in Gross, you won't find this in Grabowski, because as far as they're concerned, their goal is to confront Polish anti-Semitism. And they're not interested in Ukrainian anti-Semitism or Ukrainian behavior. This just distracts matters. Rosoliński-Lieber complains about this, that nobody wants to listen to him in Poland. The book has been translated into Polish, and he's correct on that. The apologetic historians think that the Poles are obviously much superior. These were the dominant element in Eastern Europe. How can we be compared to these sort of filthy Ukrainians and Lithuanians? I mean, murderers, much worse than us. So I believe that the comparative approach is actually very helpful in explaining that this is not a Polish problem. This is a general problem for the area. And we, that is Poles, did not behave significantly better or significantly worse than everybody else. We were all subject to similar conditions. And this, in my view, is easier for people to take. So that's why, there's both a technical and a deeper reason why I chose these three countries. Because I have to say, I remember once here, I went to the late Alan Taylor. He was a brilliant lecturer. I don't want to compare myself to him. But I remember going up to him after one of his lectures and said, Alan, it was a really great lecture. He said, well, I've given it 8 times, next time it'll be better. I have given this lecture on a couple of occasions in Poland, to the IPN, for instance, at a conference which they organized, because I was trying to influence what was going on. I believe, as I say, in dialogue.
Yes, please.
This is sort of a final point. John Gregor, I was British ambassador in Poland from 1998 to 2000. A very benign period of Polish history.
Yes.
Do you think that, this is nothing to do with your theme tonight.
No, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say.
Do you think that Poland, its default position is this more absolutist, intolerant kind of government which they have at the moment, or do you think it will swing backwards and forwards between that and a more liberal, sort of Morawiecki, Bartoszewski kind of?
I think if you look at the history of Poland in the 20th century, the main theme is a conflict between two concepts of what Poland should be, Polskość, to use a Polish term. A more outward-looking, pluralistic, European-oriented, cosmopolitan Poland, and a more narrowly Catholic, inward-looking Poland. And that conflict goes back to the 1890s, to the conflict between Dmowski and Pilsudski, to the emergence of liberal figures like Boy-Żeleński, and to the right-wing intellectuals in the interwar period. And you can trace it in the communist period as well, and you can see it in the period after 1989. The right, the liberals, people with whom we sympathize, lost power in Poland for a number of reasons. One, they were very complacent, and there was this famous statement that, what we are producing is a country where everybody has hot water. This didn't turn out to be enough, so identity politics came to play a role. This government is not sufficiently patriotic, it's full of cosmopolitans, Tusk is interested in going to Brussels, etc. And secondly, there was the resentment, or at least the feeling of a large part of the population that they had not benefited from the transition. Many of them had, but they felt they were left behind, and they felt they were despised by the people who had actually benefited from the transition. These two things could change. Obviously, you follow what's going on now. I believe the government is in difficulty. I think that the Adamovich assassination and the Kaczynski tapes and what's going on with the National Auditing Bureau and so on, these are compromising for the government. I don't think, they may well win the largest number of votes, but the idea that they'll have a majority in the next parliamentary election seems to me unlikely. Optimism is probably a sign that the situation has been inadequately perceived, but that's my optimistic position. So this will mean it's impossible for them to change the constitution. And, one of the things about Poland, it's not only a divide between, as I say, this more outward-looking and more inward-looking view of Poland. Poland is a great country of half measures. We had half a Reformation, half a Renaissance, half an Enlightenment, half a liberal democratic regime, a liberal democratic revolution in the 19th century, half a democracy, and half communism. And we're going to have half populism. We are not actually going to be in the same position as Orban. Anyway, that's my optimistic take on the situation. One of the things about Poland is the liberum veto. Now, you'll remember that the liberum veto, of course, was a feature of the Polish parliament. One deputy could not only prevent a law from being passed, but his liberum veto dissolved the parliament. This was clearly destructive of any successful functioning system. But there was one thing about the liberum veto which is very important. When you delivered your liberum veto, what you said was nie pozwalam. In Polish, it means I will not permit this. And one of the things about Poland is there's always somebody who says nie pozwalam.
One more?
Yeah, it's a short question. Is this lecture available online?
Well, if you want, just you send me an email. I'll send you my note. I've got it written out. Yes, with pleasure.
Don't know your email address.
I'll give it to Joachim. Polonsky@brandeis.edu.
Okay, that was very good. Last question. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your contributions and your questions and the discussion. But most of all, of course, Professor Polonsky, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.